year was 1212, and the Great Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa was over. A triumphant coalition of Christian forces, that is, fighting men drawn from the various kingdoms of Western Europe, stood over a field looking down upon a shattered Almohad army. And while the Muslims of North Africa had been routed, the Christian armies, due to logistics and exhaustion, were unable to pursue for the final coup de grace. The Reconquista would now take a bit of a hiatus, as the leaders of that fight would be consumed with domestic problems. Alfonso VIII of Castile would die 2 years later in 1214 and leave his country to a 10-year-old son. Pedro II of Aragon would be killed the next year on the Albigensian Crusade at the Battle of Muret, sowing the seeds of political unrest. Sancho VII of Navarre, in his landlocked and mountainous domain in the north, had little interest in invading the south. And the kings of Leon and Portugal would simply have their own agendas. On the other side of things, the Almohad Caliph, Muhammad al-Nasir, retreated quickly to Marrakesh after his defeat at Las Navas. He left behind his destroyed army and his reputation. Now, while he was able to escape the battle, he was not able to escape his assassination that came the next year in 1213. The Almohad would now enter into a period of rapid decline as massive revolt erupted across their vast empire. This downward spiral only got worse as the Almohad had ineffectual leadership, which was made even more feeble by numerous coups and power struggles. It should not come as a big surprise that with their homeland in flames, AlAndalus quickly dropped from their list of priorities. Professor Hugh Kennedy, in his book, Muslim Spain and Portugal, sums it up nicely. Quote, "The Almohad army never seems to have recovered from the casualties inflicted on it at Las Navas de Tolosa. After 1212, there is no record of Almohad troops facing the Christians again. Some sources speak of much of Morocco being depopulated by the defeat. And the surviving members of the Almohad tribes confined themselves to Marrakesh and the mountains to the south where they had originated, refusing to answer desperate appeals for help from AlAndalus." End quote. In the winter of 1227, the ruling Caliph Al-Mamun made a truce with the King of Castile, paying him a hefty tribute in exchange for peace. And in October of the next year, all major Almohad armies were strategically withdrawn from the Iberian Peninsula. I guess they weren't able to win the hearts and minds of the people. 1228 marked the end of any significant Almohad presence. But if there's anything to be learned about history, nature abhors a vacuum. In the pattern that repeated itself, the people of AlAndalus rose up once again against their North African overlords. Most of the major cities would establish some degree of independence, but again, all this would really accomplish was the establishment of a myriad of smaller, pettier, and most importantly, weaker taifa states. For those of you who are keeping score, this was known as the Third Taifa period, also known as a very easy target for anybody out there who was more organized and slightly bigger. And here's the thing, the Andalusi, that is the people of these taifas, knew that they were in trouble. There was simply nobody left in North Africa that could come to their aid. But not all hope was lost. There were those who were, let's just call them, the more politically enterprising, that managed to rise to predominance and bring together a handful of these city-states into a more formidable union. There were several areas where this would occur. Valencia had its own thing going. The lands of the Algarve were coalescing. But there were two major individuals that accomplished this. The first was a man named Abu Abdallah Muhammad ibn Yusuf ibn Hud al-Judhami, known simply as Ibn Hud. In 1228, he gained power in the city of Murcia, the very same year that the Almohads were pulling out. The other was a man named Muhammad ibn Yusuf ibn Nasr, who was known as Ibn al-Amar. This man gained ground in the city of Jaén and would eventually take Granada. Remember that name. Much more on him later. Now, of the two men, Ibn Hud appeared to be stronger. His first move was to raise the black flag of the Abbasid Caliphate of Baghdad and swear allegiance to him. Of course, in reality, the power of the Abbasid Caliphate at this point was ephemeral at best, but the move gained him legitimacy. He quickly gained the support of numerous cities, including Cordoba, Almeria, Malaga, and Seville, which now they began to look upon him with these puppy dog eyes as their new great defender. They even went so far as to call him the Emir of the Muslims. The power went right to his head. He was on a mission to regain the lost glory of AlAndalus, and the fighting spirit of the Andalusi flocked to him. However, when it came to the real challenge of taking on the Christian kingdoms, he would find that his talents were quite lacking. He would soon find out that the Christian lords of the north had made remarkable strides in the art of war. In 1230, he engaged the forces of Leon, who were busy laying siege to Merida. He was soundly defeated at the nearby Battle of Alange. As a result, Merida and Badajoz would eventually fall. 2 years later, he tried to relieve the defenders of Trujillo. He failed and had to pay tribute to Castile for a truce. Which, by the way, this truce gave Castile a free hand to ravage the Muslim lands held by Ibn Hud's rival, the aforementioned Ibn al-Amar. But he wasn't done yet. Disaster came in the year 1236 when he attempted to stop the siege of Cordoba, and yet again he was turned back. You know, in the end, there's only so much misfortune that most people are willing to put up with. His men began to abandon him. His popular support fell away. And in the year 1238, as he was on the run and trying to take refuge in the city of Almeria, one of his last remaining bastions, he was assassinated at the city gates by the man that he ironically had placed in charge of the city. It was a sorry state of affairs for AlAndalus, but one man's misfortune is another man's opportunity. This was how the stage was set for our rising warrior king, Ferdinand III of Castile. The Almohads were in retreat, no one else was coming to the rescue, AlAndalus was divided, and the remaining Muslim commanders were scrambling to hold a very much receding line. Ferdinand III had a playing field that was ready for his grand appearance, but as is the case so many times in history, the story of this powerful man begins with the story of a powerful woman. In the book A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, Betty Smith describes her main female characters as, quote, "They were all slender, frail creatures with wondering eyes and soft, fluttery voices, but they were made out of thin, invisible steel," end quote. This pretty much surmises Berengaria, or if you prefer the Castilian, Berenguela of Castile. She was a woman who was descended from a very impressive family. Her father was Alfonso VIII of Castile, again the victor of Las Navas de Tolosa. Her uncle, you might have heard of this guy, King Richard the Lionhearted. And her grandmother was Eleanor of Aquitaine, a crusader queen. Her hand in marriage was sought after, and at one point she was betrothed to the son of the Holy Roman Emperor. In 1197, she married Alfonso IX, the King of Leon, which was Castile's major rival. Perhaps there was some plan to ease hostilities. He also happened to be her cousin, and the marriage was later annulled by the Pope on the basis of consanguinity. But the two managed to have 5 children, of which Ferdinand III was the eldest child, and all were deemed by their respective courts to be, quote, legitimate. Despite their marriage, Leon and Castile would still be at each other's throats, and there would be continued conflict between the two kingdoms. Everything came to a head in the year 1214 when her father, Alfonso VIII of Castile, died. The oldest male heir and her brother was Enrique, who was only 10 at the time. Berenguela, being the eldest child, moved quickly to take the position of regent. She knew that she had to move fast, as she had many enemies in the Castilian court. The great noble families were not keen on her political abilities. They knew she was a resourceful and cunning opponent. Her biggest opponent was the House of Lara, a particularly ruthless and exceedingly opportunistic noble family who had had their sights on the throne. There were 3 brothers, of which Álvaro Núñez de Lara was the quickest to act. This man, like his brothers, held strong positions in the Castilian court. In fact, during the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, Álvaro carried the banner of the king. Through a complex web of political intrigue, he poisoned the opinions of the aristocracy and the high clergy against Berenguela, and while she was distracted trying to restore her name, Álvaro and his men came in and bribed the knight who was guarding the young king-to-be, Enrique, and then literally snatched him away, taking him into his own custody. Berenguela knew she'd been outmaneuvered, and for the time being had lost the first round. Álvaro Núñez de Lara wasted no time in his new position as regent. He knew that as long as he held the boy, he could do just about what he wanted. For me, it would have made more sense to do this takeover more slowly, but Álvaro was a man of action, and as a result, his stratagem didn't go unnoticed. I would describe him as being recklessly abusive with his newfound power. He began to generate new policies and tax codes to greatly enrich himself and his family, which of course came at the expense of the other noble houses. He essentially stole money from the clergy, seized the trade revenue from the Cantabrian ports, and took control of several castles, which most of them once belonged to Berenguela, and then he oppressively dominated the court. This was not exactly the best way to make friends. By 1217, he even began to wage war in the name of Enrique. Tensions over his regency began to get very heated. I can only imagine Berenguela's frustration at having to sit back and watch all this go down, knowing that it would only be a matter of time before she'd be forced either into a convent or into exile or found dead someplace. It was on the fateful day of May 26th in the year 1217. Enrique, now approximately 13, was playing in the courtyard of Álvaro's castle with some other children. A tile from the roof came undone and slid down. It struck him on the head as the other children looked on with horror. The wound was fatal, and as the sun set on that day, the heir to the throne of Castile was dead. Álvaro, who couldn't afford to lose his regency, concealed the child's death and hid his body in the castle of Tarigo. However, Berenguela had her spies in place and hastily learned of her brother's death. Her response was epic. Knowing that the news of Enrique's death was still hidden from the rest of the world, she dispatched 2 contingents of her best knights. The first contingent rode out to the Kingdom of Leon, where they convinced Ferdinand III, who at that time was still at court with his father, the Leonese king Alfonso IX, to come home to Castile and pay his mother a visit. It didn't seem like such a strange request, so he readily complied, but he was probably a bit shocked as to how quickly he was brought back to Castile. The other group, which consisted of Berenguela's best knights, infiltrated the castle of Tarigo, and under the cover of night, they retrieved Enrique's body and brought it back to her so she could have him properly buried in the family crypt. Berenguela then waited for the right moment, once her son, Ferdinand III, was safely in her jurisdiction, and then revealed to a stunned audience that her brother, the heir, Enrique, was dead. The fate of succession of the kingdom now hung in the balance. The Castilian court and the high clergy assembled to decide who was going to be the next sovereign. It came down to either naming Alfonso IX, who at this point was in league with Álvaro Núñez de Lara as the new king of Castile, or giving it to Berenguela. She had predicted that this was going to happen all along and kind of knew what the court would decide. When it came down to it, many members of the Castilian aristocracy would rather be dead than see a Leonese king in their throne, and even more had had enough of the manipulations of the House of Lara. Berenguela won by a landslide and became the queen regent of the realm. But there was a glaring problem to all this. The rules stated that only a male could lead the armies of the kingdom into battle. This was a fact that Álvaro Núñez de Lara was only too happy to point out. He publicly rebuked the queen for her audacity to be so daring and then demanded to be regent over her son, Ferdinand III. Berenguela may have lost the first round to Álvaro, but she sure wasn't going to lose the second. She refused to hand over her son and made it very clear that nobody was touching her boy. And then, in a somewhat stunning move, she abdicated the position of regent, leaving the throne vacant. But before Álvaro and his cronies could abscond with the title, she deftly maneuvered her son into position and had him crowned King of Castile. She made it clear to everybody that she was not the type of person that liked to lose. Berenguela's decisive move shattered any semblance for peace, and Alfonso IX, who now felt cheated of his right to unify Leon and Castile under his control, was persuaded by Álvaro Núñez de Lara and his brothers to declare war and invade with his Leonese army. They figured the Castilians were vulnerable with the new king, and they were partially right. Alfonso IX and his forces blazed a scorched earth path deep into Castile, in fact to the very gates of the city of Burgos, but that's as far as they were going to get. Now, while all of this was going on, Ferdinand III had been busy rallying the noble houses together. First from Avila, then Segovia, then Palencia, but more nobles were going to come. In August of 1217, the new Castilian king entered the city of Burgos at the head of this army to be formally recognized as the new sovereign. And then, almost immediately, he had to launch a counteroffensive against his own father. While he wasn't able to crush the Leonese forces, he was able to drive them out of his land. And when they invaded again in 1218, he held firm. In fact, in one engagement, Ferdinand III was able to see through an ambush which was set up by Álvaro Núñez de Lara. He managed to turn the tables, crush the invaders, and capture Álvaro, who I'm sure he presented to his mother as a gift. But just as a side note, this was not going to be the last time that a king of Castile would have to deal with the House of Lara. However, at this point in time, Alfonso IX of Leon had had enough. He made peace with Ferdinand III and recognized him as a king in his own right. Berenguela would continue to serve as Ferdinand's closest advisor, guiding him in his ascendancy and serving once again as regent while he was on campaign. While she might not have had direct power, her actions would still have major ramifications. In 1219, she astutely arranged for her son Ferdinand to marry Beatrix of Swabia, a member of the powerful Hohenstaufen family. And when I mean powerful, Beatrix happened to be the granddaughter of Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor. By the year 1224, Berenguela got really good at the game of succession. She had a very crafty mind, the kind that allows you to see like 5 moves ahead in chess. She went right to work arranging new marriages and establishing political networks with the sole intent to prevent other kingdoms from being able to muscle their way in and claim any right to the Leonese throne. She knew that the aging king of Leon, again Alfonso IX, wasn't going to be around for much longer. And more importantly, she knew that he didn't have any male heirs. Well, let me put it this way, at least no male heirs that he was willing to recognize. At this point, he had all but written Ferdinand out of his will. As was expected, a few years later, in the year 1230, Alfonso IX died, leaving his throne to his 2 daughters, Sancha and Dulce. But before they could get comfortable and coalesce with their new sovereignty, Berenguela swept in with charm and grace, and, how do I say this politely, she made him a deal they couldn't refuse. She managed somehow to convince the daughters of Alfonso IX, for fine estates and an insane chunk of cash, to relinquish their claim on the Leonese throne. The ink was barely dry on these documents when Berenguela quickly, emphasis on that word, ushered her son into the city of Leon, where he was crowned king of the Kingdom of Leon, and this before anybody could say otherwise. Leon and Castile were thus united under Ferdinand III. They would never be divided again, and the legacy of Castile would go on to have world empire implications. Berenguela, in her later years, was a devoted patron of religious institutions and military orders, like the Order of Santiago. She would continue to serve as Ferdinand's closest advisor, and in his absence while he was on campaign, she would help govern his land, which was now both Castile and Leon. Ferdinand's respect and admiration for her never wavered. He would come to her for her counsel during times of need. As it turned out, they met in the year 1245 to discuss matters of state and to enjoy time in the company of family. But little did they know that that year, mother and son were to meet face to face for the very last time. She died the very next year on November 8th in the year 1246 and left behind a legacy of being one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages, albeit a bit unsung. Her focus had always been for the betterment of her son, and her sacrifice was not going to be in vain. Ferdinand III would become one of the greatest leaders the Reconquista had ever witnessed.